needles. Without needles, we can't quilt. We can have a fabulous machine, we can have the best thread on the market, a fantastically pieced top, batting and backing fabric, but if we don't use a needle, we can't quilt. Fortunately for our long arm quilters, we have a little bit of a smaller selection of needles to look at, whereas a domestic machine quilter has got way more options to consider, a different needle for every type of fabric, including all the various sizes. So we have Gross Beckett needles that we use. That is our brand recommended needles, and you'll see that is a packet of needles that comes with your machine. And issued is a standard needle, which we call a sharp, and that basically translates to a universal needle, which has a sharp-ish point, not to the point where it will cut all of the fabric fibers. In general quilting fabrics, it will spread the fiber open and your needle will just simply go through. We also can then get ballpoint needles. So when you have a situation where you're working with a batik or very finely woven and densely woven backing fabric, especially, that's where we see the issues, then a ballpoint needle is recommended. And when do you use that? When you look at the back of your quilt and you see holes. In other words, holes where you can see fibers that were cut and those holes never close up. That's when you want to switch to a ballpoint needle. And the difference is a ballpoint needle has a slightly rounded point which opens up the fibers and penetrates through it instead of cutting the fibers. And like I said, we especially see that with very densely woven backing fabrics. That's where a ballpoint needle comes in handy. I do know of quilters that switched over to ballpoint needles and exclusively use only that. I then have an issue sometimes when we're working with a thicker top fabric or where there's a lot of applique, or maybe you have made a quilt from jeans. The ballpoint needle then is just not sharp enough to penetrate through all of those fabrics and might give you jumped stitches. So those are things to look for. If you have jumped stitches, double check your needle. Okay. Then the third needle that we do get is the MR needle, or the high frequency, high speed needles. Now these needles have got a cranked shank or a shaft, and I'll post a picture for you probably up here on what that looks like. And those needles are applicable to the much larger machines. The Infinity, for instance, which is a heavier machine but also has a much higher motor speed. So quilters using those machines tend to work faster and need a needle that has been strengthened to keep up with that pace. So that is where the MR needles go into. We do get titanium coated needles. Those are on the market, just not available in South Africa. We haven't really seen a need for it. If you have your good MR needles for your bigger machines and high speed ones, if you have your sharp needles, and if you have a ballpoint at your disposal, you'll be able to cover any and all types of fabrics. Where we consider the fabric is opposite to what a domestic machine quilter will do. So when we have a very fine fabric that we need to work with, we're going to go smaller in our needle size, as opposed to a different type of needle when it comes to a domestic machine. So let's say you are making a silk quilt with a silk backing fabric as well. Then I would recommend you go to a 14 needle, size 14 needle for that, because the fabric is finer and we want the holes to be as small as possible. Also, if you are going to work with silk thread, but maybe on cotton fabric. So there's two options that you need to look at. First of all, in general, the size of a needle comes into play depending on the thickness of the thread. But for us long arm quilters, because we only work with essentially two types of needles, we also need to consider the type of fabric and how dense and thick that quilt sandwich is that we're going to work through. So let me just rephrase this. Needle size according to thread thicknesses. Okay, so silk thread and possibly a monofill on a size 14 needle. If you have hassles that your thread is shredding, then go up a needle size, so go to 16. Okay, general quilting with our polyester 40 weight thread, and I use it even for my polyester 60 weight thread, will be a 16 needle. That's a general needle. That's what most of our quilting is done with. It leaves a small hole and it copes well with the majority of threads. Again, if you then tend to have an issue of skipped stitches possibly, but specifically shredding of thread where it looks like it's, shredded and raveled that end, then up your needle size, then go to an 18. If you have, for instance, a quilt with a huge amount of very thick and heavy applique, you might have to do the majority of work in an 18 where you are stitching on top of your applique. If you are making a quilt from denim, which has got a huge amount of seams, for instance, layer upon layer upon layer, 18 needle. Okay, so apart from the thread thickness, we also need to then consider our fabric thickness. Our general cotton quilts with quilting cotton fabric, several layers, seam allowances, our 16 needles should be perfectly fine coping with that. Like I said, if you have issues with your thread shredding or skipped stitches, go a needle size up before you start looking for the culprit in another place. Thinner thread, thinner types of fabrics, thinner needle. Now, you might ask, how long does a needle last? Well, the short answer is a needle lasts as long as it can still perform its function. Okay? It's very difficult to quantify time or size or any matter of that into how long a needle lasts. A good rule of thumb is between 8 to 12 stitching hours. So that's physical needle up and down time. Okay? But that also depends, because if I'm going to do a custom quilted quilt with highly densely quilted areas, huge amount of stitches, I might actually get only 6 hours out of a needle instead of a large overall pattern with a big stitch length. There I might be able to get 16 to 20 hours worth of proper work from that needle. So as long as the needle still performs its core functions, giving you a good proper stitch without shredding or cutting your thread, your needle is good to go. A couple of rules of thumb that you can look at is, number one, I work as new project, new needle. Okay, so that helps me eliminate any potential issues. When I start with a new project, I put in a new needle. But a project can also be a placemat. So if I'm only going to do one placemat, I'm not going to replace my needle for the next placemat. That would just be unnecessary. But if I'm doing one of my highly custom in densely quilted 30-40 hour quilts, I might actually go through 2 or 3 needles in one project. And I will definitely change the needle before I start with a new project. You'll also hear that you can hear when the needle starts to get blunt, and then it won't start performing the way it should be. So the more you work, the more you become in tune to the noises that your machine makes. A blunt needle, that sounds like someone is stomping on the fabric, that's what you'll start hearing, along with a bobbin that runs empty. You get used to those sounds and know then what to change or what to do. So look at that aspect of a needle. In relative terms, our needle is the most inexpensive part of the quilting, but it is the most important part of quilting. So don't skimp on a needle. Don't haggle about that too much. You need the needle to work properly for you to perform and for you to create and for you to put out amazing quilts without any hassles and issues. Okay, so look for a good quality needle. As with everything in life, quality counts. So we recommend the Grass Beckets, and they're available on the website, and they're available wherever we then vend and sell our stock. Okay, any questions on needles? You're welcome to pop a question down below in the comment box, and we will get back to you on that. So hopefully that answered some questions. Plain and simple, 2 types of needles, 3 sizes that we work with, and you need to just make sure that you pick the right one for the job.